Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Northamptonshire Schools Forum on Thursday, 13th of March. We'll just begin with any apologies for non-attendance. So, Raj, I'll just hand over to you for that.
Yeah, I received apologies from Sandra Appleby, Angela Prodger, and Robert Tite, and Emma Matthews is attending as a substitute.
Hi, welcome, Emma. Great. If everybody could just sort of nod if they're happy to accept those apologies, that would be great. Thank you. And any declarations of interest in the current agenda? No. And Raj, anything regarding forum membership changes?
There are no changes to report.
Great. Thanks ever so much. So I'll move on to item number 2, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of January. And first, we'll just have a quick check for accuracy. Does anybody have any comments? I won't go through these page by page unless people want me to, but does anybody have any comments or points on accuracy in the minutes of the last meeting? Great. And if you could just then nod or thumbs up or wave at me if you're happy to accept those as an accurate record of the last meeting. Perfect. Thanks ever so much. And any matters arising or officer feedback? I don't think there are any points from officers' feedback that we're expecting from the last meeting, but any matters arising from last time's agenda? No, great. Okay, we shall move on to point number 3 on the agenda, which would be Amanda, but I can't see her having joined. So what I might, as if on cue, there we go. Amanda's just entered, I think. I'll just wait for Amanda. I'll let her know she's timed that perfectly.
My camera's just thinking about it. Afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon, Amanda. You've timed your arrival perfectly because we've just done the kind of business matters and the minutes of last time. So it is over to you for a verbal update on Northamptonshire's education and transformation date. So
welcome, everybody. Apologies. For some reason, you can't see me. So I will obviously share this and then I'll come back. So just in a sense of an update, there's been a slight change with personnel. So I'm now the Assistant Director of Education. There have also, you may have seen, adverts have gone out for permanency. The process over the last 6 months, I think from Sharice's point of view, has been to really sort of understand what's needed in the organisation, to see what structures would work most effectively in order to drive a locality-based offer, and really to focus our efforts on team around the schools so that we can really be at the heart of each community, supporting communities through that sort of early help offer. So the aim being to expedite the need for more intensive work later on. So the work is underway within the council looking at locality-based models. So looking at obviously Kettering, Corby, Wellingborough and East North Hants, and looking to build sort of like a navigator type model within each of those settings so that families feel better supported and more able to access, I suppose, guidance and support at the earliest stage. So there's that sort of going on in the background. So the permanent positions that have now gone out are within the structure that NNC wishes to move forward with. In the background of that, there's also some work going on about restructures and repurposing skilled people within the council. So there's quite a lot of work going on, but obviously hasn't come to fruition yet. But in the meantime, within the local authority, there's a focus on improving systems and processes to ensure that we are as effective as we can be and that we are as transparent as we can be. So within education, for example, there's a big focus on AP sufficiency because we recognise that when the West and the North were split, most of the provision was in the West. So we recognise that schools, all ages actually 0 to 19 in a sense, have an area where they are in need of support. So expressions of interest will be asked for after Easter, the aim being to look for 8 or so provisions that we can develop within existing settings, because obviously that's a quicker model also, and support be put in place. But more information will come out around that sort of after April. There's a large piece of work going on around SEND transformation and looking at developing SEND strategies that are not just paper exercises, but systems and processes that really help to support families and young people in Northants. Work also around improving processes, really around identification, looking at the process for SENIF and SENIF Plus for those 0 to 5s, and then looking to see how that process then feeds into schools to ensure that there's a seamless transition if there needs to be to an EHCP, and or hopefully by that early help support at SENIF and SENIF Plus, then we have young people that are supported with their emerging needs that may or may not then need to transition to an EHCP. So there's quite a lot of work going on in the SEND space and in inclusion, but hopefully with the permanent positions and appointing to those, it creates a sense of security for schools and partners as we move forward. Were there any other questions on that or anything else that people would like me to elaborate on before I go back and get a camera?
Hi, Amanda.
Hello.
We had a secondary heads meeting this morning, and I know that some of the secondary heads weren't aware of all the changes, hadn't realised that Fran had interim post had come to an end. I wonder if you've got a kind of organisational structure document that could be shared with well, more widely, but specifically for me to share with the secondary heads following our meeting, just even if obviously, like you said, there's still some interims in post and those positions are out, but presumably the structure of that, you alluded to it being slightly different. It'd be useful to know who's in post, even if there are interims, but also to know what those posts are, because I think there's definitely a feeling that we're not necessarily sure who to go to at the moment.
That makes me very sad, Catherine, because I shared all of this in the newsletter 3 weeks ago and I shared it again last week. But yes, so as I said, the structure is evolving. There are key positions that, again, we shared last week, who was in an interim position, as well as contact details. So those head roles, AP sufficiency, sort of access and planning, head of SEND, head of inclusion, my role, etc. They were all shared last week, but I can reshare them again. And similarly with the structure change in Fran, we did identify that on that first week back and explain. So Fran's moved into a consulting role of supporting with the structure, so that we have the capacity to ensure that that's effective and done in a timely manner. So I can share what there is at the moment, but as I said, that's not the structure that we're moving to, in the sense of dependency. But I will share what I can and those leads positions, but I wouldn't want to mislead because, as I say, it's an evolving piece of work. The aim is to have positions appointed by the summer, so then we have a smoother transition as we move into September 25.
I mean, I was aware of some of those changes, but it came up within the meeting. So I said that I would try and pull some of that together to share. But perhaps when the structure's finally in place, if we could sort of have that as a one document to go out, I think, yeah, that would be helpful for people.
Yes, of course.
There's probably, Amanda, I was just going to clarify, when the method for sending it out was the weekly newsletter, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I think it's a tough thing, I guess, for Forum about how we try and encourage decent readership of the newsletters, because I think that's sometimes an issue. And I know we've discussed this about when you put forward consultations about kind of how widely read that newsletter is and any steps we can take to encourage that.
Yes, I don't know whether maybe it's a sector thing, because I know that the primary heads were aware, so maybe it's just a secondary pickup with there being less, I don't know, with different trusts and academy setups. So, but everybody does have access to that. But we can look at it. I think the website is also being developed, so that becomes that sort of single point of access as well. So I think once that's concluded, that will have various platforms that will be easier for partners internally and externally to navigate. Yeah, thanks. Andrew, I think I saw your hand up there.
Yeah, I suppose welcome, Amanda. We also, I guess, would like to pass on our thanks to Fran, because she made some valuable contribution to this forum. Pleased to hear that she's still involved in some way or other. I guess the point is been made by others, because I mean I was at head teacher conference last Friday, and that I think it's fair to say that a strategic approach to informing key partners of the direction of travel, the staff appointments, the strategy, and that sits behind that operational map is probably needs to be a bit more intentional, if you don't mind me saying. I don't think it's good enough just to say it's gone out on a news sheet. We are, of course, operating within an environment with a tremendous amount of staff change, uncertainty.
Yes.
90% of the narrative, and with all due respect to you this afternoon, because I appreciate you've just come in, but you've done the same, which is about it will be on a website. We will be having a lot of it's about future projection. I'm sorry to sound harsh on that, but I'm just
No, that's
thinking of it from the perspective of those people who are on the front line trying to deliver in challenging circumstances. So I think we look forward to content and substance which is about our doing, and not just is going to be done, because people would be forgiven, I think, for feeling that they need to build some confidence in the council in relation to stability and actual tangible outcomes that we can all see, particularly in the area of high needs. So
yes.
I'm sorry to make that statement a bit publicly, but I'm sure there'll be people watching this feeling a little bit frustrated that we're still in this kind of transitional stage with things, and that none of that is obviously leveraged at you as an individual, because you're just here and just joined, and we're all pleased to see you.
Or not. But yes, so I think just to come back on, I do completely understand, and I think as a children's service we do understand that a lack of sort of permanency does create unrest and worry and fear. Change is fear, can be fearful anyway, but we have
I think it's
as
also about quality.
actions.
It's also about quality as well, Amanda, isn't
No,
it?
of course, but beginning of March we met with CEOs, and that was an open offer, and we met at sort of in Corby, Western, and then every CEO was invited. We didn't have a full representation, but we had a fairly good group actually, which was quite nice to see, and they're the start of meetings going forwards. And very much at that session, I led that session. There was discussion around SEND, inclusion, and AP sufficiency. We've started locality heads meetings. They started last week with primary heads. So we had representatives of head teachers from Kettering, and we're doing them in a locality base. So Kettering session, Corby session, and again, head teachers came to listen to what we were talking about, that we were actually doing, and how we wanted to work in partnership, especially around that sort of graduated response to PECs and exclusion, and then trying to glean input. And then next week we have a session in Wellingborough at Wren School, and we have a session also at East Northants. So we're trying to get out into the community and go to those spaces so that we can hopefully engage in different ways. And I fully appreciate that the platform of a newsletter isn't always ideal, but I think that the cogs of a local authority can be slightly slower at times, because there are sort of competing priorities. But the aim is to deliver, and the message and the things that I've seen do evidence that. But I appreciate I'm probably 3 or 4 people down the line saying that. So we can only do better, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the thing I'd really reinforce, Amanda, is I think those kind of, the head teacher forums, the CEO forums, I think they are absolutely welcomed. And I think that sort of engagement is exactly what people want, because I think that constant communication really does help with building confidence for those things. I mean, the thing I just wonder about communications is if there is any way of splitting up because I think there's huge amounts of valuable information in the newsletters, but it's splitting up what is kind of information and adverts and training opportunities and CPD from the things that the local authority really wants all stakeholders to know. And I wonder sometimes it is, perhaps they belong in 2 slightly different formats. And I think that way you might actually penetrate through people thinking, well, actually, if it's this format, this is the stuff that I 100% need to know about what's happening at the local authority. And even better if they can be then stored on a website. So if they are missed, I think, well, if I need to know anything about NNC from a school's point of view, there's a page I can go to that's really easily navigatable and can find out who does what, who I contact about what, in exactly the same way that I think probably schools and trusts are quite good at now, so that you can kind
Yes.
of look online and think, well, if I need X, I go to this person.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that is something that, excuse me, it isn't in place where it is elsewhere and is in other local authorities. I think the newsletter is an option at the moment. And again, the way that it's presented again links to the fact that there isn't a website behind it. But what is being designed, because the School Effectiveness Service is the first one that's really should be going live, that is certainly the platform. And I think we try to arrange it so that key information is at the beginning of the newsletter, and then below it, as you say, is that signposting to different things. But again, we can continue to evolve that. I send that out, well, you know, check that anyway, so we can continue to move forward and try different things. And it might even be that maybe we add a summary newsletter with key events that, you know, comes out on a different time or is headed differently, that just purely has updates. But I'm hopeful that you will start to see more once things go through, you know, that kind of senior leadership point of view within the council, because there are a lot of things that are close to being finalised, which I know doesn't help, but I know also that once those out, it will bring clarity. We're sort of in that in-between stage.
Perfect. Thanks ever so much, Amanda. I think it probably is worth also, I echo Andrew's comments as well about just recording for the minutes. Thanks to Fran for all her work she did as the interim too, and to wish you all the very best, Amanda, in your new role.
Thank you.
Any other questions there under point 3? Okay, I'll hand over to Soraya for point 4 and the Q3 monitoring update.
Thank you, Chair. So this report outlines the position of the DSG grant at Q3 for 24-25. Coming down to section 3 of the report, the DSG grant for 24-25 amounted to 388.4 million. This is adjusted and agreed at full council to include a budget deficit of 7.7 million for the high needs block. The DfE adjusts throughout the year, and the adjustment so far to the DSG is in the March allocation, the early years block budget was increased by 792k. The July allocation, we had the early years block budget was decreased by 174k, and the high needs block budget was also decreased by 107k. November allocation, the central schools block has been increased by 28k, and this relates to additional copyright licenses costs. The early years block has also had a decrease by 703k, and the high needs block has also been decreased by 6k. The forecast outturn is a pressure of 5.6 million. The net spend is forecasted to be 401.6 million against the approved budget, resulting in an overall deficit that's taking in the 7.7 that was put into the budget, taking it to 13.3 million, and that's summarised in table 3 in the report. Moving on to section 4 of the report, the outturn for 23-24 carried forward a deficit of 6.8 million, and taking that into account, the forecast for the cumulative deficit by the end of the financial year is expected to be 20.216 million. And that's broken down under section 4.1 of the report. The main pressures are still in the high needs block, and they've been grouped together into 5 main areas, and those are summarised under section 4.3. The schools block has shown a underspend of 1.2, and this is due to reduced spending on planned growth, as the development of committed projects planned for 24-25 have progressed at a slower pace than originally anticipated. The early years block is also showing an underspend of 3.8. At the end of 23-24, there was 1.2 that was carried forward for a potential clawback from the DfE, and then this year there's been a underspend of 2.5 million, and that's mainly due to deprivation, TPPG, and SENIF. However, there is still an adjustment to be made on early years block, because that doesn't take into any sort of clawback that we might have for 24-25 yet. Section 4.12 of the report details the work that's taking place within the service to help mitigate these pressures. And Sharice's outlined those previously in her report. And then Appendix A attached to this report breaks down the spend to cost centre level, and School Forum are asked to note the report. I'll open up to any questions.
Any question? Or I can see Rob, please. Rob, you muted there, I think.
Sorry, yes, I did press the button, but it didn't clearly work. Thanks, James. Yeah, a couple of questions, really. Let me just go to where I've got them. So, obviously, we're reporting a position where the schools block and the early years block are both underspent, and the high needs block is obviously, as we know, significantly overspent. Are we saying now that we're just in a position where the potential underspends on some blocks will simply reduce a potential deficit, which, if we're really honest, is the high needs block? Technically, what it might look like is that we are further utilising the schools block and now, to a larger extent, actually the early years block, to subsidise a high needs block overspend. And obviously, with the operating model going into 24-25, where we've got a much larger growth fund as well, we are potentially in a chance of doing that again, because for example, the schools block underspend is because, according to the paper, is because that there has been not quite as much a need to spend that growth fund. Is that correct? Do you feel that is the way it is, that we're just now going to use the schools block and the early years block to subsidise high needs in this way?
So the way that the DSG is set up, any underspends in any of the blocks, we can't. So with the early years block, we can't go back out and give it to providers because the DSG is in a deficit position. Had we not been in a deficit position, we would have been able to go back out and give that back out to providers and early years nurseries and stuff.
Okay, so
because the guidelines say that we can't do that, we have to kind of use it to offset the overall deficit.
Okay, so what I'm saying to Schools Forum is, where you have a lot, let's just take the schools block and then we'll talk about earlier, but where you've got a large growth fund and it underspends, you are always going to be in a position where that is used, and it has been. We've seen overspends for the last 3 or 4 years in high needs, but that's always going to be used in a position to further subsidise the high needs block. And that's my concern, in that we, at the last meeting, I know it's been slightly rounded or reduced down, but we've voted for a £4 million growth fund for academic year 25-26. And if there's a large underspend in that, as there appears to be a large underspend in growth fund this year, it simply gets put back in and allocated to the high needs block. Whereas actually, if we'd had less of a growth fund that was more accurately forecast, then more money will be going directly to schools in that circumstance. Do you follow my logic on that?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And that's what the planning team is looking at, which is what School Forum have asked for, to have better reporting on the growth fund, and that's due to come in 25-26. I know there isn't a report in this pack which kind of goes through the growth fund and stuff, but Fran has kind of taken that into account when at the last School Forum meeting.
I can't put my hand up at the moment, but I'm just going to say that there was a discussion when we had the planning around this meeting that we would bring just an information report to the next session, which I think might highlight some of that, because I think you're right, Rob. What the aim is, that you want money to be going to where it's going to be most effective, and I think it'll be important for us to review the spend historically, to see how and why that funding is in place to that level, so that it is reviewed basically on the funds that are there. So that is a discussion I've had with Fran, is a discussion we had at a planning meeting with James, and it's something that we will bring to the next meeting.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm sorry, Paul, I know you've got your hand up and you're waiting very patiently, but just again, just so I can be clear on this, even if you're bringing us the Schools Forum members the best reporting form, the most accurate reporting form around the spend of the growth fund, once that pot is confirmed, as it was at the last meeting, you can bring us the best reporting against the growth fund you like all year. But if that fund underspends, it is always going to, because as Soraya said earlier on, because the overall DSG is in deficit, it is always going to fund the deficit reduction. Do you see what I'm saying? So really, the most important thing is about when you set the growth fund, because
Yes, that's what I'm trying to allude to. There'll be lesson. We will review where we are, and we'll review then in the sense of previous years as to whether we are setting it at the right amount.
There's probably just two quick things that might help out the answer to that, because I think the position for the growth fund is the same as in early years, is that if there is a surplus, there is no mechanism for the local authority, for the NNC, to port that back to providers or for schools. But does, for example, the growth fund carry over its surplus into the next year, or is that used to essentially offset the overspend in high needs? What actually happens to that? Because I think there's probably two separate things. Is whilst you may not be able to port it back to providers, does that, if the growth fund surplus remains in the growth fund for the following year, then that means actually there might be less of a need for additional income into there. Whereas if it disappears back to zero, I think that goes to Rob's point, is essentially the growth fund is being used to offset the high needs in a bit more of a planned way. Does that make sense? That's probably one for Soraya or Yoki. Like, what actually happens to that? Does it disappear back to zero at the end of each year?
The finance comes, if you want to respond.
Yeah. So with each block can't have its own underspend. It has to be treated as a whole. So at year end, any under or overspends in each block will come down to the bottom figure in that sense with the overall DSG budget. So we can't carry forward any sort of under or overspends in each sort of block.
But you can carry forward the overall underspend, obviously, in the total DSG.
Yeah,
of course. So just building on that a little bit, what that makes me think is next time we come to vote on the growth fund, as in the size of the pot, we're going to have to look very carefully, and I'm sure School Forums members are going to have to look very carefully about the arrangement around the growth fund, particularly if there is then an underspend on it. And I would expect to see a much lower growth fund amount put forward to remove from schools block. And I know some of it depends on what the forecasts of places look like. Some of that, I have to be honest with you, I'm not totally convinced is accurate. Because otherwise we could end up in this problem every year. And I'll kind of finish it there.
Yeah. No, agreed. I mean, I think that's a point well made. I think that's where Amanda is talking about there's the reporting on how the growth fund is actually used within year. But I think the other thing we talked about at the pre-meeting is how do we make sure we've got really good information in advance of making a decision on what the total amount in the growth fund should be, so that we're clear it approximates to the need. So the aim would be to spend as close to 100% of the growth fund as it's possible to do.
Yes, so that the aim being that it is actually set against what it needs to be set against. allowing for things that can come up that, but generally it's in line with forecasting.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, James. I think there were, I mean, just following on, Rob, I think that has been Forum's concern. When just briefly following on from this, it felt like we bumped up the growth fund knowing that we couldn't utilise it or couldn't spend it, or at least not being sure about that, on the basis that we couldn't transfer more than 0.5% from DSG into the high needs block without Secretary of State's permission, which we certainly wouldn't have got. So it feels like it's been a bit of a backdoor way of trying to balance the budget in this year and this year alone at the expense of schools. But we'll see. I mean, we might all be proved wrong, and the £4 million will be spent on the growth fund, and everyone will feel very relaxed and think, well, that's great. And I have mentioned before with the early years block, and I appreciate that underspend will likely go down as any clawback comes through, but the early years are the part of the sector where all finance is stretched, but early years is really, really stretched, and particularly those providers in that space, and they seem to be subsidising, regardless of this growth fund argument, the overspend on high needs block, and trying to get money back out to them, I'd have thought would be something that we might not be able to do, but is quite important when we're setting our budgets going forward to make sure we're passporting out as much as possible. I've read later in the reports, by the way, I think the underspend on early years is more around participation than actually rates. So participation numbers go up, then so will the spend, and that would even out. Just a couple of quick more procedural things on the report. On 4.1, we're talking about cumulative deficit at the end of the financial is expected to be 24.2 million, which I was a bit confused how that ties into the 20.2 that is in the following chart. And obviously the chart before is 13.4, but I can see that's pre the brought forward deficit. Is there a reconciliation between the 24.213 and the 20.216?
Sorry, I think that's just a typo. I'll get that changed.
Okay, that's great. That's fine with that one. And the other question I've got in, and again, this is probably just my understanding of it, on 4.8, we've talked about the CENIF funding and the preschool settings draft out term pressure of 334,000. Again, the pressure result from increasing access to the fund. And then in 4.11, we're talking about part of the underspend being due to lower deprivation, teachers' pension, and CENIF. So I was that started to confuse me a little bit. With regards to CENIF, have we got a cost pressure, or have we got a cost saving?
So in the high needs block, you have CENIF Plus, which is different to the CENIF that's in the early years block. Kelly can probably come in and explain the difference between the two. So in the CENIF Plus, which is in the high needs block, there's an overspend on that budget. But in the early years block, the CENIF that's in Kelly's block, that's showing an underspend. So I'll just pass that over to Kelly.
Hi everyone. So CENIF in early years is the Special Educational Needs and Inclusion Fund. It's got very, very strict criteria and can only be used for children with low level and emerging needs. So it sits within the early years block. It does mean that certain targeted adult support cannot be covered by CENIF. We have just done a piece of work regarding the data of the children, and the process for CENIF and CENIF Plus will be changing in the coming weeks. We have one of our new vision strands that we will be delivering shortly, and that will be looking at the two CENIFs to make sure that we can capture as many of the children with low level and emerging needs as possible. We haven't had that many providers take it up this year. We've tried promoting, we've pushed that forward, we've done mail outs, but we're going to start to do a more targeted targeted approach in service.
Okay, thank you. The final bit on the report, I just got a question on, and it might be that I haven't clicked on the link, but on the 5.8, the high needs benchmarking tool, have we got? We've talked in that paragraph about having comparative benchmarks against similar trusts. Is that something that we've got or can put in a paper on high needs around how we are comparing with trusts with similar characteristics or areas with similar characteristics to us? Or if I clicked on the link, would that show me now?
I can take that back and feed that back to School Forum as part of the high needs update at the next School Forum meeting.
That'd be perfect.
Is that okay? Yeah.
That'd be perfect. Thank you. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Soraya. I saw a couple of hands, various things. I think Marie, then Salik. We'll go to Marie.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a question, please, about the table in 4.3, because we had previously asked that EHLF and EHCP were separate lines, so we could be really transparent about the awarding of that money. So do I presume that Mainstream Top-Up incorporates both EHLF and EHCP funding? And can I also ask if EHLF is continuing, because the panel that was due to meet last Friday was cancelled at very short notice, and all of the children's submissions that went in for that are presumably sat pending. So I just wondered what was happening to EHLF for the future.
So yeah, Mainstream Top-Up does include the EHLF. I'm not sure about the panel, and I wouldn't be able to kind of comment on that, but I can take that back and ask the service some feedback through Raj.
The panel's probably one for Amanda, if Amanda knows, or if not, it might be something that we need to ask Kevin or Troy.
I can find out for you and feedback.
Thanks, Amanda. And Suraj, just to that point in the future, is there a way of then splitting out that Mainstream Top-Up into the locality funding and the
I could do that. Yeah, for 25-26. I could take that on.
Thanks. Salik, did you have something earlier?
I'm just going to mention about Senif, but Kelly covered it in terms of we did at NNC, we did do a lot of push outs for local PBIs, and John wanted to take that up, but we haven't had much take up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Salik. Rob, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a couple of other questions on this agenda item. There seems to be a slightly odd numbering, so I'm going to talk about after 4.12 that's on page 17, it then goes back to 4.4 for some strange reason. So I'm going to talk about 4.7 that's on the top of page 18. So just so you don't get confused, I think it's on page 16. It's the 4.7 that's on the top of page 18 that I'm talking about. It talks about where the local authority is in deficit on DSG, it must, or where a surplus is substantially reducing, they must provide the DFE with information to the DFE about pressures and savings, etc. It then says at the very last sentence, work has been ongoing through a joint working group to develop this plan. I'm assuming is the DFE deficit management plan, which will be shared with the School Forum in due course. Can I just ask if there's, if they can just give perhaps School Forum members a flavour of what type of action is being considered in that plan?
So at the moment, we did get together, as in a couple of the service areas and stuff, to go through the DSG management plan. But because we've had a change of leadership, Sharice is setting up a new strategic board to kind of take this on. So we don't have anything to feed back to School Forum at the moment on that. I don't know if Yoki and Amanda want to say anything further on that.
I don't have anything to add. Perhaps Yoki does.
So much on the plan I can come in. I know there's a lot of financial modelling that's been taking place at the moment in terms of what our average cost is, what the amount of pupils we have, and against that, what intervention and mitigation we can align that with Sharice's broader strategy and vision that she talked about last School Forum. our data team is working closely with our SEND team, and hopefully we'll be in a better position to come back and update the forum.
Okay,
And
so at the moment we'll just have to hang on and wait for that paper, which is fine if that's what we have to do. We'll hang on and wait for that. But it's just you know, as it said, it's met and is already currently working. It's just really interesting to know what the flavour of some of the actions, because it's a, you know, it's a difficult position, and it's good for school forums members and schools locally to get an understanding of what the direction of travel might be in terms of those actions. Can I just ask really briefly on 5.12? It talks about the local authority stakeholder engagement team, the DFE, sorry, local authority stakeholder, meeting with local authorities around a number of ways in which they can potentially try and secure additional funding to help with the high needs block funding, so the safety valve and the DBV mechanisms, etc. Now, last time I asked about this, I was told that those have been put on hold by the. I think Fran said those have been put on. Is that still the case? And we're not able to even consider those as part of our sort of additional funding that we might ask for. I recognise there's always some criteria with that, but is that still not a possibility right now?
That's what we've been told by the DFE. You know, with the change in government, all the safety valve and the Delivering Better Value program has all been, you know, it's stopped. So we do not know what the next steps are at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, James. Can I just come back to Rob's point there? Just in terms of, sorry to labour it, but that plan that's been referred to, can I just confirm, because I see on a number of other council bodies, and I have to confess their plans seem to be a lot more advanced than we are at the moment, and it's beginning to worry me. We are less than 12 months away from D-Day, are we not? Because although the safety valve's been removed, the date that, correct me if I'm wrong, but last council meeting I was at, so a few weeks ago, the date that was posed was, I think, March 26th. So we're now entering into that last 12-month period, which obviously, if we take out school terms and things like that, in terms of consultation with schools of the impact of that plan, is beginning to look extremely tight. Is there any chance that we could just have some idea of timescales on the plan? Because I don't want to look back and say, well, we're as a forum party to what turned out not to be a plan that was formulated in time. I appreciate there's lots of reasons for that. And of course, I do appreciate, as Rob articulately says, we know this is a complex picture. I'm thinking about the consultative dimension to the plan in terms of the number of people you're going to need to engage now over a very short time period.
Schools Forum will remember, probably, was it the December meeting, Charlotte Franks brought a presentation to yourselves on high needs block.
Sure.
So up until Sharice's arrival, the council was actually working on the DSG management plan. We had what we call a deficit recovery group, which we used to meet every Wednesday morning, every week. And so together with the data team, we have done a lot of modeling, in terms of the various funding groups, of schools and providers that we fund on high needs block. And if you remember that presentation last year when Charlotte Franks presented it, that was actually produced by our colleague in data team, Tom Barden, and Charlotte presented it at this meeting. And basically it explains the different bathtubs, if you remember correctly. Yeah. And, all the different, whether it's mainstream or special schools or SEND units, where the pressures are and where the lack of sufficiency of places are for Northamptonshire Council. Obviously when Sharice came, and then Sharice had her, her strategy. And if you remember, she also presented a strategy to yourselves in the previous forum, or was it the forum before? Obviously all these have changed. Now, what Sharice have now done is actually set up the SG strategy board, which, is just beginning to take off. So, we're still at the early stages of what her plans are, to deliver the strategy she has, for Northamptonshire. So as a consequence, you know, it's difficult for us to actually share the SG management plan with you because obviously the leadership has changed and the direction of travel
So
has also changed.
sorry to interrupt, just to be rude, but I think that echoes to the points that were made at the beginning of the meeting, and we do respect and understand and are grateful for that evidence-driven work that was done to try and put the building blocks in place upon which decisions might be based. I'm afraid I still come back to the point that we don't have a plan and we don't have any dates for a plan. And it sounds to me, with all due respect, that original intentions and I'm going to use the word promises, but aspirations, we say, that were set out, let's say in September, which I think if we went back and looked at minutes and what have you, were intentional and well meant, but now don't seem to have been followed through to the point where we haven't got a clear answer to when a plan is going to be put forward. And I'm just mindful of the fact that our colleagues in schools, us plus those delivering, are already planning on a 3-year cycle, possibly longer for some, their financial strategy for coming years, their deployment strategy, their staffing strategy, and this kind of thing. As you'll appreciate, this isn't something that can ever be done in isolation. And the level of overspend, should the government decide that it will not cover the council's overspend, I suspect it will have no choice because of the number, but it will come with caveats, won't it? Very significant caveats. We've got to be prepared, haven't we, as a region, to be able to implement those things. It doesn't sound at the moment that we're particularly well poised to do that. And I'm not belittling the problem, but my experience elsewhere over the last few weeks suggests that we are quite a way behind now in this, and it could well have a material impact on our young people.
I think this is something we need to take it back, obviously, to Cherise and obviously how the whole process, strategy is progressing.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I just ask if Andrew has been on others? What sort of other strategies has he? I'm not saying that North Northamptonshire Council will follow these, but have there been any that you have heard whilst attending other meetings, Andrew?
I think the biggest principle, Rob, is making sure that there's a recognition that the strategy that's being adopted is going to push back resource requirements into school-based level. And that needs to be modelled in real detail to make sure that it's realistic. Because although there's a cultural shift in terms of so-called mainstreaming, but that has to be driven, doesn't it, by a really good understanding of what the system can cope with in a way that's going to deliver quality. And I think I'm correct in saying, aren't I, that at the moment the council are receiving upwards of 126 applications a month for EHCP, so those numbers are still rising. So of course, there's a multiple effect on those being awarded. So I think that, and the other thing is, Rob, is obviously, and this is the bit I don't know, so forgive me, officer colleagues, because you may say we're doing this, but there's a very strong look at what others are doing to try and piece together at a contextual level the practice that is resulting in outcomes that is going on in other authorities. So again, that's where the plan can come in. It very much drawing on things that are working elsewhere. Because it's not to say that lots of local authorities don't have their deficit, but I think some of them are making greater strides to formulate conceptually and get with everybody on board how a joint action is going to cope with what can't be sustained because it's structural. I mean, I'd look at the all-inclusive program that's going on in Cambridgeshire as an example, or programs going on in Rutland. I know it's a small local authority, but same problems, or across the border in Hertfordshire and places like that. Sorry to give a bit of a vague answer, but
that's great. Thank you.
No, it's really helpful that, Andrew, because I think kind of, as Yoki alluded to, what Cherise has presented is I think we have an understanding of what the overall strategy is, which is the move towards the locality model.
Sure.
And there is a kind of, call it what you like, but the mainstreaming thing, I think there is clarity about that. But I think you're quite correct that what's missing is a specific plan of what that looks like in action and what that means financially. And I think the concern probably about timing is I think it was probably a couple of meetings ago, 2 or 3, that the DSG boards, the strategic board was mooted, and that there would be an invitation for forum members to sit on that board. But I don't know whether that has happened or whether that board has actually met yet, or whether that still is pending. And I can see Amanda's keen to come in there.
Sorry, my hand feature isn't working other than my own physical hand. What I would say about that, though, is that is all tied up. And I know it sounds like an if and a but again, but it's all tied up in the model that's being created. At the moment, Fran, Charisse and I and various other heads of service are working on what this structure will look like, actually populating from the existing council employees and existing strengths, how this navigator model will work, how the structures will work. So all that is happening. That's what Fran's role is at the moment. So she's liaising and been liaising with me during this meeting about what that structure might look like and how we're doing. So all of that's being costed. And then obviously then you're looking at job titles and you're looking at what can move across. So it is a huge piece of work, but it all fits in with the direction of travel. So that is being costed to see what X and Y, but it's not in a position to share, which I know, again, doesn't necessarily help Forum. But what I would suggest is that the next session, I think we can take this back, and we do recognise that what you need is a level of clarity and a visual understanding of what the process is going to be and what the timelines are then associated with that. So the timeline for us is September, but again, what's going on internally, I appreciate is something that you want to have sight of at whatever level we can give you sight of. So I think it's something for us to take away and feedback to Charisse, and then either she can come and share that at the next session, or we can.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I'd say, on behalf of Forum members, is that, I think that you have a number of members of Forum that are quite willing to be generous with their time and to sit on those boards with yourselves as a council. And you're right. Yes, of course, what Forum wants to see is the kind of finalised plans. But I also think, that if I would encourage you to kind of, I guess, take up the option of Forum members' generosity to sit on that, because actually it would be quite useful for Forum members themselves to feed back on what had happened in those meetings, without the expectation that actually what they're going to be presented with is a finished plan. Because I think actually, you might find their contributions helpful towards your strategic decision making.
I'll definitely take that back. And also, just as an aside, I was speaking to Andrew Campbell Tuesday actually, just about as well utilising those trusts that have got a bigger footprint as well in NNC, and just seeing how actually we can utilise work going forward. So again, that might be something that feeds into that too.
Yeah, if I may, can I just come back on that?
Please do, yeah.
And thank you, Amanda. And I appreciate the hard work that's being done, and I had some level of briefing off Fran from that as well, which was very compelling and positive. But it's just a plea, really, which is to make sure that we don't there's the internal integrity structure of the authority in the way that the service is structured. I understand that. But of course, it synchronises into a much bigger infrastructure, of which Andrew is a part, of budget setting and operational planning, an order of magnitude larger actually than the council. And I'm just nervous that we are not making any presumptions, and this would be the plea, that there's no presumptions made about the operational impact of changes in delivery methodology for children with high needs, that make presumptions about additional resource that may not be there, even though the willing professional behaviours are there in the existing budgets, and that includes whole trusts and individual school budgets at individual maintained school. And I'm not talking on behalf of other colleagues on here, but that has to be factored in. It has to be modelled, and I'm just worried that that was my concern that I raised with Charisse at the beginning, which was I felt I absolutely encouraged the welcome that a kind of drive to create a new approach, but I was concerned that needs to be backed by the detail, because the devil is in the detail here, as to whether it is operationally deliverable, given the budgetary situation and planning that's already taken place by schools. And And that requires a really, really good communication strategy between the executive leaders of those schools and trusts and trustees, actually, of an understanding of what they're going to be able to stand or not stand. And I think that we may get alignment on behaviours and appetite for a different approach. But if it isn't fundable at a fundamental level, then we're in trouble, aren't we? And that's the bit where I feel that we're perhaps not as far on as we could be in terms of being helpful to ourselves.
No, I understand. As I say, I will take that back and bring something that gives you a little bit more information, but also share with Sharice that offer to having that a greater partnership engagement.
Amanda.
Thank you.
Great. We'll move on to item 5, which is the schools Q3 monitoring, and it's over to Sadiq for this one.
Thank you, Chair. So this report highlights Q3 monitoring for NNC maintained schools. As previously, all maintained schools have submitted their budget plans except for Penn Green. We're still awaiting those. In terms of in Q3, more schools had the back pay award come through, and it paints an accurate picture. Out of those, we've highlighted schools that are in a deficit. NNC this week, the panels convened, and I would like to thank the chair and the vice chair for giving up their time to attend those panels. We have now, by the end of this week, issued out the next steps for those schools and look at the schools that are in a risky position and how we can support them to help balance the books going forward. Any other questions? I'll open up to questions.
Nothing, it seems, on that item. The bit I was just going to feedback is, as you mentioned, Sadiq, Paul and I attended with Amanda and Sadiq and other finance colleagues those panels as mentioned. So, you know, they are something that kind of had been mentioned at forum members had expressed support for, and those are now underway. And I think will have a positive impact on supporting schools with financial management. I don't have any kind of further questions or comments on that. So thanks, Sadiq, for that report. And we'll move on to item number 6 then, which is the scheme for financing schools. There's an update here, but also I think a vote for approval on this item too. So Sadiq, that's over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so the scheme for financing school has been updated to reflect the DFE guidance. Under section 4.5, planning for deficit budgets, DFE has guided local authorities in effect to introduce a threshold into where a school must submit a recovery plan to the local authority. Our deficit policy already included that, however, now this has been also included in the scheme for financing schools. And under 12.1, we've updated capital versus revenue, where the maintenance of school has been updated. We met up with our capital team, and I think previous scheme wasn't clarifying what was required, and we were getting capital bids in from schools for items that were below the de minimis values. So that's been updated to reflect as such. I opened the panel up for any questions. Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, I was muted myself there. Paul, over to you.
That's all right, thanks. So there's a couple of questions. Some of them are just really around, I think, more typos, but there's a couple of then a little bit more substantive ones. So if I run through them quickly, on page 41 of our pack 2.10, submission of forecasts, I think there's in the last paragraph, I think there's a some words missing. It says it is important for schools up to date. I think there's supposed to be something between that to be up to date, maybe. So if in the final version you might just want to look at that. Yeah. I do want to come back to, well, no, I'll come back to this one. This is one just I wanted to ask whether you wanted to consider in there in 211 school resource management. The paragraphs in there make complete and utter sense about effective management of resources. In the academy system, we have a requirement to use a form of integrated curriculum financial planning and to calculate our 12 key metrics. I appreciate that's not necessarily the case, but for effective management of resources, I don't know whether you want to consider whether you would want to add in some form of requirement to have a degree of benchmarking or key benchmarks in there. I just wanted to mention that's something that you might want to consider or not. The other point, another point on 2.19, we talk about the NCC policies, and the first one around provision and relates to the EU Procurement Directive. You might want to just check that and update it for the Procurement Act 2023, which kind of superseded the old EUOJ stuff, and just reference that. I'm sure the council must have done that by now. The hang on just a second. The on page, yeah, page 51, 0.4.9.5, we talk about the arrangements of license deficits. I don't know whether in there, I couldn't see how that related to the deficit recovery panel, and whether perhaps in that section 5 it's worth giving a nod to the fact that there is the panel, and that is something that we'll be looking at, the recovery plans, because I didn't think it was included in that section anywhere, and I thought it was probably more appropriate to just have some nod in there onto that. And the final point I've got, sorry, galloping through these, but on page 56, 8.6 teachers' pension, it looks to me like the 4th paragraph and 3rd paragraph are just repeated. I think there's the last paragraph in that section seems to be a repeat of the paragraph above. So when you're finalising the document, it might be worth just checking out. So a couple of them are just kind of more, drafting or typing type things, and there's just a couple of substantive things around benchmarking and around the work of all the submissions into the deficit panel. I thought might enhance the document if you wanted to look at those.
No, I agree with those, especially the deficit policy. I think we should comment that exists, and we should follow that. And around the panels, I was just going to ask you, what do those matrix look like then for an academy that we can?
The 12 key matrix, they benchmark against national benchmarks around, but effectively they're around. There's a number of staffing ratios. They're around contact ratios, average class sizes. They're around staffing to income split between teaching, SLT costs in relation to income and total teacher costs. They're in relation to curriculum support staff and non-curriculum support staff. So they're benchmarked around there. There's one around basically sustainability, so income and expenditure, but they're set out. I can send some details that that the integrated curriculum financial plan looks at, but effectively it's looking at a range of issues which, if you follow the benchmarks, will give you an indication of where there might be areas of improvement or where there might be spend that is out of line with the funding. But I'm happy to send some details across on that would perhaps be helpful.
Thanks, Paul. I think that would be really useful. And actually, it's, you know, probably one of the interesting thing about the panels is, yeah, how we can provide schools with support around things like an appropriate size of leadership team and appropriate staffing structure for both kind of educational support, non-educational support, those types of things, because I think that obviously is incredibly helpful to schools in ensuring long-term financial sustainability, as that is probably the common reason for schools ending up in deficit, is that their staffing structure is out of kilter with their income and pupil numbers. Andrew.
Yeah, just on Paul's point though, I mean, obviously that's a very important point you've made, Paul, but they're also mirrored across, of course, into the new financial benchmarking toolkit that was released last month. So can I just get some reassurance that, because that's very detailed and actually excellent, it's out of county as well as in county comparisons with schools that you define of your own size. You can also group schools. So can I just get some confirmation that we are as a council using that tool with those schools, because that is what it's for and it's quite fundamental.
Obviously, Catherine is the person that goes out directly to schools. There is a finance newsletter that does signpost information, but I'd need confirmation from somebody from finance to see how they're signposting that.
If the answer is if the answer is we're not, then we clearly need to, don't we? Because those tools are,
yes, of course,
are really important and quite fundamental to any guidance or support that we might be giving any one individual school.
I think just to summarize, I think it's systematic of what's going on with it within the developments at the moment. It's developing those clear processes and systems, and it's ensuring that we're trying to be preventative as opposed to reacting to the situations that we see in schools. And it isn't every leader's forte, finance. But we've recognised that actually there needs to be perhaps a focused support as well from school improvement around that, and actually liaising closer with finance colleagues. So that's something that's already been put in place. So the schools that originally were that I inherited that had financial deficits, those meetings have already taken place with school improvement providers, school improvement partners rather, who are obviously experienced head teachers. And I think having those conversations and that level of challenge is another way of supporting that, but it's a level up from the work that the school's finance team are doing, if that makes sense, because actually you're talking to it's a constructive critical look at your organisation and structure. And similarly, that training will go on as well next year, as well as adding some training around new head teachers, so they'll be mentored for a year. And I think that will hopefully help as well with that process. So again, these things are coming online as a traded service in and free to sort of see new heads 25-26.
Okay, and there's a strong governance component to that, I presume.
Yes, there's a really good governing programme anyway within SE, but again, the schools that perhaps are facing a challenge around managing and reducing their deficit and understanding the urgency that's required, because quite a lot of them are long-standing and are growing over the years. It's about really giving that short-term support, but also understanding how you can long-term deliver that. But the governance structure around that, so when schools are experiencing difficulty, there's a paper that will come to forum after it's been through lead members, which is around developing that education improvement framework and looking at 4 key profiles of a school. And if a school is vulnerable or a cause of concern, financial management being one of those, then it would instigate a certain level of support, like you would have in a trust. A trust is my background, like you would have in a trust, and really understanding that you then target support, but also from a financial point of view. So that's very much the direction of travel with that as well. But once that improvement framework is shared, it very much highlights the level of support and the types of support that would be offered. And part of that would be this financial security, and really unpicking what the aspects of leadership and governance are. And aspects of that are ensuring that the governors have the capacity and the capability to drive the school forward, and to ensure that they
And I guess it's getting the balance right, isn't it, between holding schools to account, which is the statutory responsibility of the local authority where they remain maintained schools, but also operating a traded service where you're providing advice into that system. Yes,
and then obviously part of the process as well is what we would call a targeted rapid improvement process. And then if that isn't effective, then obviously working towards a support and intervention from the DfE, looking at financial delegation, looking at IEBs, etc. So it's very much following that process so that schools are supported, but equally schools are financially viable.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Andrew, for making that point. I think you're right. And I think that the kind of further thing I add is this might be something for school effectiveness is there is the intervention for the schools causing concern, but there's also part of any, I guess, a more standardized school effectiveness approach where you make sure that governors and leaders do understand the benchmarking tools that are available to them and do use them to make sure that they proactively manage finances in a sustainable way so that actually they never slip into becoming a cause for concern financially. Just regarding this item, obviously we've suggested a couple of amendments to that. Do you want forum members to vote on this subject to you making the amendments, or do you want to make the amendments and then bring them back? What's the time pressure for you?
I think, Chair, if you don't mind me saying, I think the amendments need to be made and it needs to be brought back here before you make the decision.
Great. Are you happy with that? So we won't vote on that if you're happy just to make those amendments, and then we'll bring it back to the next forum for approval. Perfect. Great. We'll move on to item 7. Kevin, I notice you've arrived perfectly timed. For over to you for an update on the permanent exclusion clawback policy.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Great. I'm not familiar with the IX for Zooms. Okay, so this is the deferred paper around the clawback policy for permanent exclusion. I think this was a piece of work that was done because the previous policy wasn't compliant with national policy and DfE guidance. A lot of work has been done on that now, and the new formula now reflects all the legal guidance. So the policy reflects the guidance and the regulatory basis as it says in item 10.2. And fundamentally, that is that the per pupil funding formula will reflect the individual profile of the pupil being excluded, and each individual pupil will therefore have a slightly different tariff based on those particular characteristics. We've been through various iterations of this. I know there was a query about it. We did go back to DfE and just check on the legal and regulatory background to this, but we're now comfortable that this is correct. So in terms of the implementation, I think my understanding is that in the previous financial year there was already a payment made, an invoice issued to schools, and I think what will happen, I think some payments have been made back based on the new formula, and I think what we can expect is that another tranche of payments will be sent back to schools based on the 23-24 financial year to April of that year. From then on, the methodology for doing it is that we will be doing it after the spring term, after the half term of each term. So for autumn term, it will be spring half term, and that's basically because as you know probably better than I, that when a child is permanently excluded, there's a lot of governance that goes on. There's governors, obviously, there's IRP, sometimes the PECs can be rescinded. So the idea is to wait until after the half term to make sure that that whole process has been completed and we have accurate numbers and we don't create a lot of extra work for ourselves or for schools. So the plan at the moment is that invoices, credit notes will be issued for the balances for the period 23-24 financial year, and then very quickly we will be able to issue invoices for summer term this year, last year, the autumn term of this year, and then the spring term will be, which is this term, will be calculated and invoiced for after half term in the summer term. So that's fundamentally where we are. The formula will now reflect the pupil, individual pupil characteristics. There'll be an alignment and an adjustment payment for the period, for the financial year 23-24, and then ongoing we will then issue the invoices for the summer term, the autumn term, and then it will be after the half term of each term in the following term, just to allow for all of the process and governance that goes on around having a pupil permanently excluded. I think I'm right in saying it does say in the paper that it's asking for approval, but I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think actually we need approval. Maybe Yoki will be able to add something to that, but that's fundamentally where it is, and we're asking you to acknowledge that, and then we can implement it and get on with making the payments. Any questions?
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. And yeah, just on the vote, as I noticed in the paper, it does say a vote, but I haven't got on my list that it does require a vote, because I think it's a local, I think it's your policy. It's not for, it's for us to question and comment on, but not for our approval. Yeah, understood.
The other thing I would note, and I will note it because someone who's eagle-eyed will definitely say, is halfway down the paper it says please see the flowchart below, but the page with the flowchart clearly hasn't made it onto your copy, for which I apologise, and I'll make sure that that is forward, but I'm sure every school will get a copy of this anyway.
Thank you. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James, and Kevin, thanks very much. This is the most straightforward and simple clawback policy I think I've ever seen from the local authority. So thank you very much for putting it together. I think it's really easy to understand, and I'm glad that you have that confirmation around legal compliance. Now, I think that's really important moving forwards. I can now go back to schools in my area, not only in my own trust schools, but schools in the area that I cover, and just explain this to them. I'm sure, as you said, something will come out to them anyway, but just explain that is the case so that they can have that understanding moving forward. So thank you for that. The only one question I have is around on section 2.3, it talks about the clawback of funding from schools will be based on a per pupil funding formula. And then it talks about that would have been generated from the school's budget share and pupil premium grants. So we should be able to work out for a pupil or pupil payments other parts of the funding formula, and then if they've got PPG, is that just so because I know I'll be asked this question by other head teachers, does that mean that that's what it's going to be taken for to calculate that, or is it that the local authority will kind of calculate what that per pupil formula funding amount plus potentially PPG is for, and issue those rates, or is it just going to be done on an individual basis? And if so, is it just funding formula plus PPG, or is there anything else involved as well?
I think it's my understanding that it would be everything that attaches to that pupil, but I'm happy to. It's a slightly technical bit, and it's probably slightly beyond my technical knowledge. So rather than just say for sure that's the case, but I think that is the case. But I will check and come back to you.
Right, thank you.
Catherine.
Actually, it was a similar sort of question, and you know, it's hopefully not a situation that happens very often, but yeah, it was. If, for example, I was permanently excluding a pupil premium student in October, is it literally that it claws back based on the the percentage of time that student's been with us, because obviously sometimes the funding that you spend on them is much more upfront. You know, you might have provided them with uniform, you might have provided them with a laptop, etc., etc., and you might have spent an awful lot more on them in the first month than 1/12 of their funding, if you know what I mean. But I'm assuming that what's clawed back is actually based on just the amount of time they've been with you.
I think it's the number of days, if I'm reading the paper correctly. Is that right, Kevin?
Yes, it is, and it is the amount of time they've been with you, definitely.
Okay.
Marie.
Thanks, James. Yeah, well, similar question really. So would EHLF and EHCP funding also be withdrawn? And then at what point do you calculate that that was issued? Because it says whether they were present on census day or not. So you could end up paying back a lot more for a pupil premium send pupil than your school actually received for them because of the lag in receiving those other two funding streams. So whilst none of us want to permanently exclude, it just needs to be really, really clear.
Yeah, again, I would probably be talking outside of my expertise for something quite as detailed as that. I'm happy to go away and just check that. I think the principle is from the regulation that we went through is that we can't claw back anything you haven't had. That's the kind of guiding principle. So my assumption would be no, but again, on the nuance of that one, I'd have to talk to colleagues just to make sure how that was being applied, because there's basically a very complicated spreadsheet that sits behind this and has all these things sort of written into it. So unfortunately, I'd want to make sure I was 100% correct. I'd want to just go and check, but I'll check.
Yeah, it's just particularly that bit in brackets whether they were present on census day or not.
Right.
And in Northampton, if it is continuing, then EHLF obviously might be awarded on the day a pupil is suspended, but might only have been awarded the day before. They might not have had it in full academic year.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I'll check that out for you.
So it's what you're saying is it just must take that into the daily rate. So if they have had some form of top-up funding, that may not equate to the actual number of days they've been present. Is that what you're saying? So actually, you might say, well, the amount of core funding and pupil premium funding is 105 days, but actually they've only had 10 days of
EHLF potentially.
Yes,
and also for the
exactly.
pupil premium, that's on a full lag, isn't it? From October census day, it's a year behind. So you wouldn't, as a school, you won't receive that pupil premium money necessarily until after the next census. So although the pupil might be entitled to it, as a school, we don't get it unless they're here on census day in October. So it just needs some clarity in the wording so it's fair and can be applied consistently.
I think probably the way to do it is to put a sort of technical appendix on the back, maybe, that will allow you to sort of interpret the overall policy, because as you know better than I, there's an awful lot of technicality in the various bits of funding that attach. So and there's some nuance in when it might have attached and when the people might have got next, etc. So I think we can do that and then let everyone have a copy. But in terms of the broad principle, I think that it sets it out pretty clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it might, I can't remember what document I've seen this on, but yeah, perhaps an appendix with a few different worked examples would be helpful.
Yeah, we can do that. And I think once people get used to using it, we'll work through those little nuances, because there'll always be a child that just slightly falls in a new scenario, and we can find out how that works. I'll take that away and get that done.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thank you. Anything further there? We'll move to item number 8, which is schools block update, and this is over to Soraya.
Thank you, Chair. So this is just a quick update to School Forum following the submission of the APT. So in December School Forum members were advised that there was a temporary pause in Weldon Village's academy growth. After we've submitted the APT, the DfE have come back to us to say that we need to build in 150 pupils, so 5 classes for Weldon Village. And this is just to update School Forum that's been, the APT's now been revised and sent through to the DfE. So the overall effect on the schools block is that there'll be a reduction of 421k from the growth fund, which will then be moved back into the school ISB, and that's shown under section 2.3. 2.4 just gives you a revised schools block allocation, and then Appendix A attached to this is the mainstream schools funding formula, but most schools have received their budgets, so you should have, it's basically following on from that. So the recommendation to School Forum is just to note the report. So there'll be the transfer to the high needs block still stands at 1.5 million, and the minimum funding guarantee still set at 0%, gains capped at 0 and scaled back to 100%. After which all the remaining funds in the schools block has been allocated to the growth fund, and that now stands at 3.6 from the 4 million that was consulted and kind of agreed at the January forum. So I'll open up if anybody's got any questions on that one.
Any questions or comments from members there? No, thanks ever so much, Raya. Just move on to the final item. Any items of urgent business from anybody? No, wonderful. Thanks as always, everybody, for all of your contributions. And I'll declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Right.